I watched my husband's luggage disappear around the baggage carousel while I sat in the airport medical station with my twisted ankle, realizing he'd just boarded his connecting flight to Paris without me. 27 years of marriage, and he couldn't wait 2 hours for the swelling to go down. The nurse handed me an ice pack and asked if someone was coming to get me. I stared at my phone. No missed calls, no texts, nothing. That's when I knew exactly what I was going to do with the return tickets I'd hidden in my purse. You have to understand this wasn't some spontaneous cruelty. This was Christopher being Christopher, just more so than usual. For nearly 3 decades, I'd been the wife who made everything work, his career, his comfort, his dreams. When he decided at 58 that he needed to find himself through travel, guess who researched every destination, booked every hotel, and yes, paid for every trip? His consulting business had been struggling for years, hemorrhaging them over using money on failed ventures and questionable investments, while my inheritance from my mother sat untouched in accounts he didn't even know existed. My mother, bless her practical soul, had left me everything when she passed 5 years ago. The house she'd owned outright, the stocks she'd quietly accumulated, the bonds she'd never touched, all of it came to me with very specific instructions. "Don't tell Christopher about this money, Deborah," she'd whispered during one of our last conversations. "I've watched how he spends what you earn. This is for you, for your future, for when you need to take care of yourself." At the time, I thought she was being unnecessarily dramatic. Now, sitting in that sterile airport medical station with my ankle throbbing and my husband somewhere over the Atlantic, I understood she'd been giving me survival instructions. The trip to Paris had been Christopher's idea, naturally. "We need this, Debbie," he'd said, using the nickname I'd grown to hate over the years. "We need to reconnect, rediscover what made us fall in love." What made us fall in love was a 22-year-old version of myself who thought his ambition was charming and his confidence was attractive. What I discovered over 27 years was that his ambition was actually entitlement, and his confidence was really just an inability to consider other people's needs. But I'd paid for the trip anyway. First-class tickets, a week at the Hotel Le Bristol, dinner reservations at restaurants with Michelin stars, all of it charged to the credit card connected to my mother's account. Christopher assumed it was coming from our joint savings, the same account he'd been slowly draining with his business ventures. He had no idea I'd been quietly protecting our actual assets, while funding his dreams with money he didn't know existed. The morning of our departure, I'd felt something close to optimism. Maybe he was right. Maybe Paris would remind us why we'd stayed together. Through Christopher's midlife crisis, in my mother's long illness. Maybe sitting in sidewalk cafes and walking along the Seine would help us find our way back to each other. I'd even bought new lingerie, packed in tissue paper at the bottom of my suitcase, like some kind of romantic offering to the gods of struggling marriages. We'd made it through security fine, grabbed coffee at one of those overpriced airport cafes, and settled in to wait for our boarding announcement. Christopher was scrolling through his phone, probably checking his business emails for the 100th time that morning, when I decided to use the restroom before our flight. That's when it happened. One moment I was walking normally, the next I was on the ground, my ankle twisted at an angle that made my stomach lurch. The fall itself wasn't dramatic. No grand tumble down a flight of stairs, no collision with a baggage cart, just my heel catching on a wet spot near the bathroom entrance, my body going down hard and my ankle rolling in a way that sent lightning bolts of pain up my leg. A janitor helped me to a nearby seat while someone called for airport medical assistance. And within minutes, I was being wheeled to the small medical station they keep for situations like this. "It's probably just a sprain," the nurse said, examining my ankle with professional efficiency. "But you're going to need to keep weight off it for a few hours, maybe get some x-rays when you get home just to be sure." She wrapped it in an elastic bandage and handed me a pair of crutches. "You definitely shouldn't be walking through airports or sitting in cramped airplane seats for the next several hours." I called Christopher immediately. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice already tight with irritation. "Where are you? They're about to board first class." "I'm in the medical station," I told him, explaining about the fall, the ankle, the nurse's recommendation. "They think I should wait a few hours before flying. Maybe we can catch the evening flight instead?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Then Christopher sighed, that particular sound he made when I'd somehow failed to meet his expectations. "Debbie, this is our first real vacation in 3 years. I've been looking forward to this for months. Can't you just take some ibuprofen and tough it out?" "Christopher, I can barely put weight on it. The nurse says—" "The nurse isn't paying for these tickets," he interrupted. "Do you know how much this trip is costing us? and the hotel reservation isn't refundable if we don't show up tonight. That phrase, costing us, lodged in my chest like the tip of a needle. The trip wasn't costing us anything. It was costing me, specifically, money that Christopher didn't even know I had. Money my mother had left specifically for my protection and independence. And here he was, lecturing me about the expense, while I sat with a swollen ankle and a growing understanding of exactly how much consideration I could expect from my husband in a crisis. "I know how much the trip costs," I said carefully. "But Christopher, I physically can't walk right now. Even if I could make it onto the plane, I'd be miserable for 7 hours, and then I'd be hobbling around Paris for a week. So what are you suggesting? That we just throw away this entire vacation because you twisted your ankle?" The way he said it, like I deliberately injured myself to inconvenience him, made something shift inside my chest. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. "I'm suggesting that maybe my husband could show a little concern for my well-being instead of worrying about the money." "Of course I'm concerned about your well-being, but I'm also being practical. We can't afford to lose this money, Debbie. You know things have been tight with the business." Things had been tight with his business. My freelance editing work had been steady, my mother's inheritance was substantial, and our actual shared expenses were manageable. But Christopher had a way of making his financial stress become our financial stress, his problems become our problems, his needs become the only needs that mattered. "Why don't you go?" I heard myself say. "There's no reason both of us should miss the trip." "What are you talking about?" "I'm serious. Take your flight, enjoy Paris, and I'll join you when my ankle feels better, maybe in a day or two." Another long pause. I could hear the boarding announcement in the background on his end, the gate agent calling for first-class passengers. "Are you sure, Kesh?" he asked, and I could tell he was already mentally on that plane. "I'm sure, Maya," I said. "Go, have a wonderful time." "Okay, well, if you're really okay with it." He was walking as he talked. I could hear the sound of his footsteps echoing through the terminal. "I'll call you when I land. Maybe you can catch a flight tomorrow or the day after." "Maybe," I said. "I love you, Debbie." "I love you too." But as I hung up the phone sitting in that sterile medical station with my ankle wrapped and throbbing, I realized I wasn't sure that was true anymore. Maybe it had been true once. Maybe it would be true again someday. But right now, watching my husband disappear toward the gate, without so much as offering to stay with me until I felt better, love felt like a word that belonged to other people. People whose husbands didn't calculate the cost of their injuries against the price of vacation packages. The nurse brought me another ice pack and asked again if someone was coming to get me. My husband had to catch his flight, I told her, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "But I can call a taxi when I'm ready." She looked at me with the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen this particular scenario before. "Take your time, honey. There's no rush." So I sat there for the next 3 hours, icing my ankle and thinking about Christopher's voice when he'd calculated the cost of staying with me against the cost of missing his vacation, thinking about how quickly he'd agreed to leave me behind once I'd given him permission, thinking about my mother's words about taking care of myself and the money sitting in accounts that bore only my name. By the time I felt ready to stand and test my weight on the injured ankle, I'd made several decisions. The first was that I wouldn't be joining Christopher in Paris, not tomorrow, not the day after, not at all. The second was that Christopher wouldn't be returning from Paris on the schedule he expected. And the third was that it was time to have a conversation with my lawyer about exactly what my options were for a woman whose husband had just demonstrated, with crystalline clarity, exactly where his priorities lay. I took a taxi home to our suburban house, the one we'd bought 15 years ago when Christopher's business was thriving and my editing work was just beginning to build momentum. I'd always loved this house, the way the afternoon light filtered through the kitchen windows, the garden I'd spent years cultivating, the reading nook I'd carved out in the converted sunroom. But as I hobbled through the front door, leaning heavily on my crutches, it felt different somehow. Emptier, but also more mine. Christopher called that evening, his voice bright with Parisian enthusiasm. "The hotel is incredible, Debbie. You're going to love it. The room has this amazing view of the courtyard, and the bathroom has one of those deep soaking tubs you always talk about wanting." I was sitting in my reading nook with my laptop open, scrolling through the website of Morrison & Associates, the law firm that had handled my mother's estate. "That sounds lovely," I said. "How's your ankle feeling? Think you'll be up for traveling tomorrow?" "I'm not coming to Paris, Christopher." What do you mean? Is your ankle worse than you thought? My ankle is fine. Well, it's healing, but I'm not coming to Paris. The silence stretched long enough for me to click through to the firm's family law section and read the brief biography of Sandra Morrison, senior partner, specializing in divorce and asset protection. I don't understand, Christopher said finally. I think you understand perfectly. You made a choice today and now I'm making one. Debbie, that's not fair. You told me to go. You said you'd join me later. I said maybe I'd join you later, and I've decided maybe means no. This is ridiculous. You're being emotional about something that was just a practical decision. I can't help it that you got hurt right before our vacation. You're right, I said, scrolling through Sandra Morrison's credentials. Harvard Law, 23 years of experience, specialist in high-asset divorce cases. You can't help that I got hurt, but you could have helped how you responded to it. What did you want me to do? Miss our flight? Lose thousands of dollars? I wanted you to care more about my well-being than about the money. Of course I care about your well-being, but I also care about being responsible with our finances. There it was again. Our finances. The finances that were actually my inheritance, my freelance income, my careful management of our actual shared resources, while Christopher's business bled money into failed ventures and expensive equipment he never used. Christopher, I said carefully, how much do you think this trip to Paris cost? I don't know exactly. Several $1,000s, probably. Why? Several $1,000s of whose money? Our money, our joint savings. I pulled up my banking app and navigated to our actual joint account, the one where both our names appeared on every statement. Christopher, our joint savings account has a balance of $847. Silence. The money for this trip came from my private account, the account funded by my mother's inheritance. The inheritance you've never seen a penny of because my mother specifically instructed me to keep it separate. More silence. So when you talk about being responsible with our finances, what you really mean is being responsible with my money. Money that I chose to spend on a vacation for both of us, until you chose to abandon me in an airport medical station rather than risk inconveniencing yourself. Debbie, his voice had changed, become smaller somehow. I'm going to hang up now. Enjoy your vacation. Enjoy the hotel room I paid for, the restaurants I booked, the city I researched and planned for us to explore together. When are you going to stop being angry about this? I don't know. But I know I'm not going to stop while you're in Paris, having the vacation you chose over taking care of your injured wife. I hung up before he could respond and immediately called Morrison and Associates. Their after-hours service connected me to Sandra Morrison's assistant, who scheduled me for an appointment the following afternoon. Then I called the airline and learned something interesting about our return tickets. They were fully changeable with no penalty, and Christopher's return reservation could be modified by the primary account holder, which was me, since I'd purchased the tickets. I changed Christopher's return flight from the following Sunday to 3 weeks later. Then I called the Hotel Le Bristol and extended his reservation to match, charging the additional weeks to the same card I'd used for the original booking. Christopher wanted to prioritize his vacation over his marriage? Fine. He could have all the vacation time he wanted. My ankle felt considerably better the next morning. Good enough to drive myself to Sandra Morrison's office, where I spent 2 hours learning about asset protection, legal separation, and the various options available to a woman whose husband had just demonstrated his priorities with remarkable clarity. Sandra was exactly what I'd hoped for, mid-50s, professionally warm, with the kind of competence that comes from handling these situations hundreds of times before. The inheritance being kept separate is excellent, she told me, reviewing the documentation I'd brought. Your mother was very wise to structure it that way. It means those assets are protected regardless of what happens with your marriage. What about our house? You'll need to decide what you want to do there. Since both names are on the deed and you've been married long enough, he'd have a claim to half the equity in a divorce. But given that the down payment came from your separate assets, she flipped through the papers I'd provided. We have options. What kind of options? Well, if you decide you want to pursue separation or divorce, we can argue that your separate contributions to the marriage, the inheritance money that funded the down payment, your consistent income supporting household expenses while his business struggled, should be factored into any asset division. But more immediately, we can ensure that no joint decisions are made about the house or any other assets while you're taking time to decide what you want. What do you mean, no joint decisions? Sandra smiled the kind of smile that suggested she'd handled husbands like Christopher before. I mean, we can put protections in place to prevent anyone from making financial decisions that affect your security while you're determining how you want to proceed. I left Sandra's office with a folder full of documents and a clear understanding of exactly how much power I actually had in my marriage. Power I'd never fully realized I possessed, because I'd spent 27 years accommodating Christopher's needs and priorities while quietly building financial security he'd never even known existed. Christopher called that evening, his voice tight with confusion and something that might have been the beginning of panic. "Debbie, there's something wrong with my return flight. The airline says it's been changed to 3 weeks from now." "That's not wrong," I said. "I changed it." "You... what? Why?" "Because you wanted this vacation more than you wanted to take care of your wife. So now you get all the vacation you can handle." "Debbie, this is insane. I can't stay in Paris for 3 weeks. I have work. I have responsibilities." "What work? Your business hasn't had a paying client in 4 months." "That's not true." "Christopher, I balance our checkbooks. I know exactly how much money your business has made this year, and it's less than I spend on groceries. I'm working on several potential contracts." "No, you're not. You're spinning your wheels with the same fantasy projects you've been chasing for 2 years, while I pay our mortgage and our insurance and our utilities with my editing work and my mother's inheritance." "I never asked you to do that." "You never asked because you never had to ask. I just did it, the way I've done everything else in this marriage. The way I researched and planned and paid for this vacation that was supposedly so important to you. So you're punishing me by trapping me in Paris? I'm giving you exactly what you said you wanted. A vacation. Time to think about what's important to you. Time to decide whether you want to be married to someone you'd leave injured in an airport, or whether you'd prefer to be a single man who can make selfish decisions without having to consider anyone else's well-being. Debbie, please, just change the flight back. We can talk about this when I get home. We can talk about it in 3 weeks. I can't afford to stay here for 3 weeks. Actually, you can. I've already extended your hotel reservation and put a credit on your account for meals. You have everything you need." "With what money?" "With my money, my inheritance. The money you didn't know existed when you decided our vacation was more important than my sprained ankle." The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Then, in a voice smaller than I'd heard from him in years, he said, "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to think. I want you to really consider what happened yesterday and ask yourself what kind of husband leaves his injured wife alone in an airport. I want you to think about the last 5 years of our marriage and ask yourself what you've contributed besides business failures and financial stress. And I want you to think about whether you want to be married to me or whether you just want to be married to my ability to solve your problems and fund your dreams." "Of course I want to be married to you." "Then you have 3 weeks to figure out how to show me that." I hung up and turned off my phone. Then I poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle Christopher had been saving for a special occasion and sat in my garden as the sun set, listening to the sounds of my neighborhood and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Quiet. The particular satisfaction that comes from finally, after decades of accommodation and compromise, making a decision based entirely on what I needed rather than what someone else wanted. Christopher called 17 times over the next 3 days, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails that progressed from anger to bargaining to something approaching genuine panic. "Debbie, please, I can't do this. I need to come home. I'm sorry about the airport, okay? I'm sorry I left you there. But this is crazy. You can't just strand me in another country because you're mad." But I could, as it turned out. And I did. On the 4th day, he tried calling from a different number, probably borrowed from someone at the hotel. I answered without thinking, and his voice came through the speaker with a quality I'd never heard before. Desperate, but also something else, something that might have been the beginning of actual understanding. "Debbie, I've been thinking about what you said, about the airport, about the money, about everything. You're right. I shouldn't have left you there. I should have stayed, should have made sure you were okay." "Why didn't you?" "I don't know. I was just focused on the trip, on not losing the money, on not having to deal with complications. I wasn't thinking about you as a person who was hurt and needed support. I was thinking about you as a problem to be solved." It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years, and also the most devastating. Is that how you see me generally, as a problem to be solved? No, yes, maybe sometimes. I don't know, Debbie. I've been sitting in this hotel room for 4 days thinking about our marriage, and I'm realizing I don't know how to be a good husband anymore. I don't know when I stopped thinking about what you needed and started only thinking about what I wanted. When did you stop loving me, Christopher? The question hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it, he said, I don't think I stopped loving you. I think I stopped seeing you. Somewhere along the way, you became this person who just handled things, who made everything work, and I started taking that for granted instead of appreciating it. Do you know how much money I've spent keeping us afloat while your business failed? No. $47,000 over the last 2 years. Mortgage payments, insurance, car repairs, utilities, groceries, your business expenses, this vacation, all of it paid for with money you didn't know I had. Jesus, Debbie. Do you know why I had that money? Your mother's inheritance. Do you know why my mother left it to me specifically, with instructions to keep it separate from our joint assets? Silence. Because she saw what I couldn't see, that I was married to someone who would take everything I gave and then resent me for not giving more, someone who would let me carry the financial burden of our life together while still feeling entitled to make all the decisions about how that money got spent. I never knew you were paying for everything, because you never asked. You just assumed the money came from somewhere, and as long as your needs were met, you didn't think about where or how. What do you want me to say, Debbie? That I'm sorry? I'm sorry. That I was selfish? I was selfish that I took you for granted? I did, but what am I supposed to do with that now? I want you to figure out who you want to be, as a person and as a husband, and I want you to do that work without me managing the process for you. How long do I have? You have as long as it takes, but Christopher, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to keep funding a life with someone who sees me as a resource rather than a partner. I'm not going to keep accommodating someone who would leave me injured in an airport rather than risk inconveniencing himself. And I'm not going to keep being married to someone who thinks my primary value is my ability to solve his problems and pay his bills. What if I can't change? Then you'll be a single man in Paris with a 3-week vacation to think about what you want your life to look like. And what will you be? I looked around my quiet house, at the garden I'd planted and tended, at the reading nook where I'd spent countless peaceful hours, at the life I'd built and maintained and protected. I'll be free. Christopher stayed in Paris for the full 3 weeks, not because he had to. After the first week, he could have bought his own return ticket if he'd really wanted to come home, but because, as he told me later, he finally understood that this wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about consequences. It was about a woman who had spent 27 years accommodating and supporting and enabling, finally saying no. He called every few days, and our conversations gradually became less about his immediate discomfort and more about the actual substance of our marriage. He told me about walking through the Louvre alone and realizing he'd never asked me what kind of art I liked. He told me about sitting in sidewalk cafes and remembering that I'd always wanted to learn French, but had never had time because I was too busy managing everything else. He told me about calling his sister and hearing himself describe our marriage from my perspective for the first time, and being shocked by how it sounded when he wasn't the protagonist of the story. I talked to Linda yesterday, he said during one of our calls, told her about the airport, about you changing my flight, about everything. And you know what she said? What did she say? She said she was surprised it took you this long to stop enabling me. Linda was Christopher's younger sister, a successful attorney who had never particularly warmed to me, though I'd never understood why. What did she mean by that? She said she'd been watching me take advantage of your kindness for years, and she'd always wondered when you were going to get tired of it. She said Mom used to worry about you, about how much you gave and how little you seemed to get back. Christopher's mother had died 3 years earlier, and I'd spent weeks helping him handle the funeral arrangements, the estate paperwork, the emotional labor of grief while managing my own sadness at losing someone I genuinely cared about. Your mother worried about me? Linda said Mom used to ask her if she thought you were happy, said she could see how hard you worked to make everything smooth for me, and she wondered if anyone was taking care of you. I sat with that information for a long time after we hung up. Christopher's mother had been a sweet woman, traditional in her views about marriage and family, but with a quiet perceptiveness that I'd always appreciated. The idea that she'd been concerned about my happiness, that she'd noticed the imbalance in our relationship even when I was still trying to convince myself it was normal, felt like a gift from beyond the grave. A confirmation that I wasn't crazy or demanding or unreasonable for finally saying enough. While Christopher was in Paris examining our marriage, I was home doing the same thing, but from a position of strength rather than desperation. I met with Sandra Morrison twice more, not to plan a divorce, but to understand my options and protect my assets. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Rebecca White, who specialized in helping women navigate major life transitions, and I began, for the first time in years, to think about what I actually wanted my life to look like. "What would make you happy?" Dr. Chen asked during our second session. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've spent so many years focused on what Christopher needed, what our marriage required, what everyone else expected, that I'm not sure I remember what I want." "Let's start smaller then. What would make tomorrow better than today?" "Sleeping in without worrying about Christopher's schedule, reading a book without interruption, making myself a nice dinner without having to accommodate his preferences. Those sound like things you could do right now." "I suppose they are." And so I did. For 3 weeks, while my husband sat in Parisian cafes thinking about what kind of man he wanted to be, I lived like a woman who was accountable only to herself. I slept until I woke up naturally. I read novels I'd been meaning to get to for months. I cooked elaborate meals just for myself, trying recipes Christopher had always dismissed as too spicy or too exotic. I spent entire afternoons in my garden, replanting sections that had never quite worked, and finally creating the herb spiral I'd been planning for years. I also started making changes that went beyond daily routines. I opened a new checking account at a different bank, one that would be mine alone. I updated my will to reflect my current priorities rather than the assumptions I'd made about shared futures. I researched graduate programs in library science, something I'd always been interested in, but had never pursued because it would have required time and money that always seemed needed elsewhere. Most importantly, I began to understand the difference between being alone and being lonely. For 27 years, I'd been lonely in my marriage, starved for genuine partnership, real consideration, authentic intimacy. But living alone in my house for 3 weeks, I wasn't lonely at all. I was peaceful, productive, content in a way that felt revolutionary. Christopher returned from Paris on a Thursday afternoon in late September. I picked him up at the airport, which felt surreal given how we'd parted there 3 weeks earlier. He looked different somehow, thinner, more uncertain, but also more present than he'd been in years. He hugged me carefully, like he wasn't sure he had the right to hold me anymore, and we drove home in mostly comfortable silence. "The house looks beautiful," he said as we pulled into our driveway. I'd spent the previous weekend deep cleaning everything and filling vases with flowers from my garden. "It looks like you." "What do you mean?" "Peaceful, intentional, like someone who knows what they want lives here." We sat in the kitchen while he told me about his 3 weeks in Paris. Not just the tourist activities or the hotel amenities, but the thinking he'd done, the conversations he'd had with himself, the uncomfortable realizations he'd reached about the man he'd become somewhere along the way. "I called my old therapist," he said. "Dr. Martinez, the one I saw after Mom died, made an appointment for next week." "That's good." I also called Linda's friend, who's a business consultant, asked her to look at my company's books and tell me honestly whether it's worth trying to save or if I should just close it down and find other work. "What do you think she'll say?" "I think she'll say what you've been too kind to say for the last 2 years, that I've been throwing good money after bad, chasing a dream that stopped being viable a long time ago." We talked until nearly midnight, the longest honest conversation we'd had in years. Christopher apologized, not just for leaving me at the airport, but for the years of taking me for granted that had led to that moment. He acknowledged the financial burden I'd been carrying, the emotional labor I'd been doing, the way he'd gradually stopped seeing me as a person with my own needs and started seeing me as a support system for his ambitions. "I don't know if I can change that. I don't know if I can become the kind of husband you deserve. But I want to try, if you'll let me." "What would that look like?" "I don't know yet. That's what I need to figure out. But I know it starts with me taking responsibility for my own life instead of expecting you to manage it for me. It starts with me contributing to our partnership instead of just taking from it. And it starts with me seeing you, really seeing you, instead of just assuming you'll always be there handling everything." I looked at my husband across our kitchen table, this man I'd loved and supported and enabled for 27 years, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Not love, exactly, but possibility. The possibility that we might be able to build something new together, something based on mutual respect rather than dependency, partnership rather than caretaking. I can't go back to the way things were, Yimige, I told him. I won't be the wife who manages your life while you pursue your dreams with my money. I won't be taken for granted or treated like a resource rather than a person. And I won't be left alone in airport medical stations, literally or metaphorically, while you prioritize your convenience over my well-being. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't just about being nicer to me or remembering to ask how I'm feeling. This is about fundamentally changing the dynamic of our relationship. This is about you becoming an equal partner instead of a dependent I happen to be married to. I want that too, he said. I want to be someone you can depend on instead of someone who depends on you for everything. Then we try, I said. But Christopher, I need you to understand that this is the last time. There's no fourth chance, no opportunity to gradually slide back into old patterns and then apologize your way out of consequences. Either you become the partner I need, or I become a woman who's happily single. What if I can't figure out how to be that partner? Then you'll have had the chance to try, and I'll have had the chance to see whether this marriage can become something worth staying in. That was 8 months ago. Christopher did close his business after Linda's consultant friend confirmed what we'd both known for years, that it was hemorrhaging income with no realistic path to profitability. He found work with a consulting firm where his skills were valued, but where he wasn't responsible for generating his own clients or managing profit and loss. It was humbling for him, working for someone else after years of being his own boss, but it was also stabilizing. He started therapy and stuck with it, even when the sessions were difficult and the insights were uncomfortable. He took over the household financial management, not because I couldn't handle it, but because it was time for him to understand exactly what our life cost and where our money came from. He began contributing to our relationship in ways that went beyond earning a paycheck, planning dates, remembering important conversations, asking about my work, and actually listening to the answers. Most importantly, he stopped seeing me as his support system and started seeing me as his partner. When I decided to apply for that library science program, he researched programs with me and helped me write my application essays. When I got accepted, he celebrated my acceptance like it was his own achievement. When I decided to reduce my freelance editing work to focus on my studies, he took on extra projects to offset the income reduction without making me feel guilty about the choice. I like who you are when you're pursuing your own goals, he told me recently. I like who I am when I'm supporting your dreams instead of expecting you to support mine. We're different now. Calmer, more intentional, more honest about what we need from each other. The old version of our marriage, where I managed everything and Christopher coasted on my competence, died in that airport medical station. The new version is still being built, but it's being built by two adults who chose each other deliberately rather than two people who stayed together out of habit and convenience. I still have my separate accounts, the inheritance my mother left me specifically for my protection and independence. Christopher knows about them now, knows exactly how much money I spent keeping us afloat during his business's death spiral, and he's working to rebuild his own financial contribution to our life together. But more importantly, he understands that my financial independence isn't a threat to our marriage. It's what makes our marriage a choice rather than a necessity. Sometimes I think about that moment in the airport medical station, sitting with my wrapped ankle and my growing understanding of exactly how little consideration I could expect from my husband in a crisis. At the time, it felt like the end of something. And it was. It was the end of a marriage where love meant endurance and accommodation meant partnership. But it was also the beginning of something else. The beginning of a marriage where love means mutual respect and partnership means equal contribution. The beginning of a life where I'm valued for who I am rather than what I provide. The beginning of understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses, even when, especially when, that someone is your husband. Dr. Chen asked me recently what I learned from those 3 weeks when Christopher was in Paris and I was home alone. I learned that I'm good company for myself, I told her. I learned that I can be happy without managing someone else's happiness. I learned that love without respect isn't really love at all. It's just habit dressed up in romantic language. And what did you learn about your marriage? I learned that it was worth fighting for, but only if both people were willing to fight for it. I learned that I couldn't save our relationship by myself, no matter how much effort I put in, or how much money I spent, or how many of Christopher's problems I solved. I learned that sometimes you have to be willing to lose something completely before you can discover whether it's worth keeping. The truth is, I would have been fine if Christopher had chosen not to change. I would have been sad, certainly. 27 years of marriage doesn't end without grief, even when that ending is necessary and right. But I would have been fine because I'd already discovered that I could build a satisfying life on my own terms, accountable only to myself and my own values. That knowledge that I would be okay either way changed everything about how I approached our reconciliation. I wasn't negotiating from a place of desperation or fear. I wasn't trying to save our marriage because I couldn't imagine life without it. I was choosing to rebuild our relationship because Christopher demonstrated that he was willing to do the work necessary to make it worth choosing. And he has done the work. Not perfectly, not without setbacks, but consistently and with genuine commitment to becoming someone worthy of partnership rather than caretaking. He's learned to cook meals I actually enjoy eating, to plan activities we both find interesting, to have conversations about topics beyond his work and his problems. He's learned to ask what I need instead of assuming I'll handle whatever he can't manage himself. Most importantly, he's learned to see my strength as something to admire rather than something to exploit. When I changed his flight and extended his hotel reservation, he initially saw it as punishment, an unfair consequence for what he considered a reasonable decision. It took him weeks to understand that it wasn't punishment at all. It was me finally using my power instead of pretending I didn't have any. "I think I was afraid of how strong you actually are, Jules," he told me a few months after he returned from Paris. "I think I was afraid that if you really understood your own power, you wouldn't need me anymore." "I don't need you," I replied. "That's what makes choosing you meaningful." We were sitting in our garden at the time, watching the sunset through the trees I'd planted years ago when Christopher was too busy with his business to help with yard work. He was reading a book about communication in marriage while I worked on an assignment for one of my graduate classes. It was the kind of peaceful domestic scene we'd had throughout our marriage, but the quality of the piece was different now. Less fragile, more intentional. "I'm sorry it took me so long to figure that out," he said. "I'm sorry it took me so long to stop making it so easy for you to avoid figuring it out." People ask me sometimes whether I regret changing Christopher's flight, whether I think it was too extreme a response to what might have been just a momentary lapse in judgment. My answer is always the same. I regret nothing about that decision. It was the first time in our marriage that I responded to Christopher's behavior with consequences that matched the significance of his choices, rather than accommodating his selfishness and hoping he'd eventually notice how much I was sacrificing. Christopher leaving me in that airport medical station wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the inevitable result of 27 years of me teaching him that my comfort, my well-being, my needs would always be secondary to his convenience. It was the predictable outcome of a dynamic where I consistently prioritized his happiness over my own dignity. The 3 weeks he spent in Paris weren't punishment, they were education. They were an opportunity for him to experience the natural consequences of treating your spouse like a resource rather than a person. They were a chance for him to understand what it felt like to be alone in a foreign place, uncertain about the future, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself and your choices. And they were necessary. Not just for Christopher's growth, but for mine. I needed those 3 weeks to remember who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's needs. I needed to experience the peace that comes from living according to your own priorities rather than constantly accommodating someone else's demands. I needed to understand that I could be happy, genuinely, sustainably happy, without managing another person's emotional and practical life. My mother would have been proud, I think. She would have approved of me finally using the independence she'd worked so hard to provide. She would have been glad to see me standing up for myself instead of endlessly bending to accommodate someone who took my flexibility for granted. She would have understood that sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone you love is refuse to enable their selfishness. "You're different now," my friend Carol told me recently. We were having lunch at the cafe downtown, the one I'd started frequenting during those 3 weeks when Christopher was in Paris. Calmer, but also more solid somehow. Like, you know something you didn't know before. "I do know something I didn't know before," I said. "I know that I'm capable of taking care of myself. I know that I don't have to accept poor treatment just because it comes from someone I love. I know that respect isn't something you can earn through accommodation. It's something you have to demand." Carol nodded thoughtfully. She'd been through her own difficult divorce 5 years earlier, had spent months rebuilding her life and rediscovering her own strength. It shows, she said, in how you carry yourself, how you talk about your marriage. You sound like someone who's choosing her life rather than just enduring it. That's exactly what it feels like. For the first time in decades, I feel like the author of my own story rather than a supporting character in someone else's narrative. Christopher is part of that story now, but he's not the whole story. He's not even the most important part. The most important part is me, my choices, my growth, my determination to build a life worthy of the woman my mother raised me to be. The library science program has been transformative in ways I didn't expect. Not just the coursework, though I love learning about information systems and research methodologies and the ways libraries serve as community anchors, but also the experience of being in school again. Of having goals that are entirely my own, of building expertise in something that has nothing to do with managing Christopher's needs or supporting his ambitions. My professors treat me as a serious student rather than someone's wife who's taking classes as a hobby. My classmates see me as Deborah, the graduate student, not Deborah whose husband's business failed and who spent years quietly holding everything together. In that context, I'm not defined by my accommodation or my patience or my ability to solve other people's problems. I'm defined by my intelligence, my curiosity, my commitment to learning. I like watching you in this environment, Christopher told me after attending one of my presentations last month. I like seeing you be brilliant at something that's completely yours. It was a generous thing to say, and I appreciated it. But it also highlighted how much our relationship had changed. The old Christopher would have been threatened by my independence, worried that my success would make him look bad by comparison. The new Christopher seems genuinely proud of my achievements, especially when, those achievements have nothing to do with him. We're planning a trip to Europe next spring, our first international travel since the disastrous Paris attempt. But this time, we're planning it together. Christopher researched accommodations in Vienna, while I mapped out museum visits and concert venues. I'm handling the flight reservations, but Christopher is managing the travel insurance and ground transportation. We're both contributing financially, both taking responsibility for different aspects of the logistics. What happens if one of us gets hurt or sick this time? I asked him while we were reviewing our itinerary. Then we take care of each other, he said immediately. Then we figure out how to handle it together as a team. Even if it means changing plans or losing money? Especially then. Debbie, that's what partnership means. It means the person you're with matters more than the plan you made. It's taken him 8 months to understand what should have been obvious from the beginning, but I'll take late learning over no learning. I'll take a husband who needed to be taught how to be a decent partner over a husband who was incapable of learning. But I'll never again put myself in a position where I'm dependent on someone else's decency for my basic well-being. I maintain my separate accounts, my independent income, my ability to leave if leaving becomes necessary. Not because I expect to need those things, but because having them changes the entire dynamic of choice within our relationship. You're not afraid of me anymore, Christopher observed recently, and he was right. I'm not afraid of his disapproval, his anger, his threats to leave. I'm not afraid of making him uncomfortable by having boundaries or expectations. I'm not afraid of the consequences of standing up for myself because I've already survived the worst thing I could imagine, discovering that the person I'd spent decades supporting would abandon me the moment supporting me became inconvenient. The worst thing already happened. I already experienced being utterly alone in a moment of vulnerability, with no one to call for help and no guarantee that anyone would prioritize my well-being over their own convenience. And I survived it. More than survived it. I used it as a catalyst to build something better, stronger, more sustainable. That knowledge is armor now. Not armor against Christopher specifically, but armor against the fear that kept me accommodating and enabling for so many years. The fear that if I stopped being endlessly helpful and flexible and convenient, I would be alone. The fear that my value was tied to my utility, that love was something I had to earn through service rather than something I deserved, simply by being a person worthy of respect. I know now that being alone is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Being ignored while living with someone is worse. Being taken for granted while providing for someone is worse. Being left to handle a crisis by yourself while married to someone who claims to love you is worse. Christopher understands this now, too, I think. He understands that my willingness to stay married to him is not a given, not something he can take for granted regardless of how he treats me. He understands that I choose our marriage every day, just as he chooses it, and that choice requires him to be someone worth choosing. "I'm grateful you didn't divorce me," he said recently, after a particularly good day we'd spent hiking and then cooking dinner together. "I'm grateful you became someone I didn't need to divorce," I replied. It's the truth. The man who came home from Paris is not the same man who left me in that airport medical station. He's more present, more considerate, more aware of his impact on other people. He's more grateful for what he has rather than constantly focused on what he wants. He's more interested in being a good partner than in having a convenient wife. And I'm not the same woman either. I'm more assertive, more boundaried, more willing to prioritize my own well-being alongside other people's needs. I'm more confident in my own judgment, more trusting of my own instincts about what I will and won't accept in my relationships. The evening is getting cool now, and Christopher has gone inside to start dinner while I finish my gardening. In a few minutes, I'll join him in the kitchen and we'll cook together, talking about our days and making plans for the weekend. It's the kind of ordinary domestic scene we've had thousands of times throughout our marriage, but it feels different now. More conscious, more chosen, more genuinely collaborative. Later tonight, we'll sit in the living room reading our respective books. He's working through a biography of Theodore Roosevelt while I'm reading about digital archiving systems for my thesis research. We'll go to bed at reasonable hours because we both have work tomorrow that we actually enjoy. In the morning, we'll share coffee and discuss our schedules, making sure we're both supporting each other's commitments. It's not a dramatic life, not the stuff of romance novels or inspirational memoirs, but it's a peaceful life, a sustainable life, a life built on mutual respect rather than codependency. It's a life where both people matter, where both people's needs are considered, where both people contribute to making the shared experience better. Sometimes I think about parallel universes, about the version of my life where I joined Christopher in Paris that first day, twisted ankle and all, where I gritted my teeth through the pain and flew across the Atlantic because maintaining our vacation plans seemed more important than advocating for my own physical comfort. In that universe, Christopher never learned that his behavior had consequences. He never had to confront the selfishness that had gradually consumed our marriage. I never discovered my own strength or claimed my own power. In that universe, we'd probably still be married, but it would be the old marriage, the one where love meant endurance and accommodation meant partnership, where I managed everything and Christopher coasted on my competence, where my needs were always secondary and my sacrifices were always invisible. I'm grateful to live in this universe instead, the one where I finally said no, the one where I chose dignity over harmony, consequences over accommodation, the one where love means mutual respect and partnership means equal contribution, the one where I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be taken for granted, even when, especially when, that refusal changes everything. The evening light is fading now, and Christopher is calling from the kitchen that dinner is ready. She yelled. I gather my gardening tools and head inside to join my husband, not the husband I married 27 years ago, but the husband he chose to become after I finally stopped enabling him to be less than he was capable of being. And as I wash the soil from my hands and prepare to share another meal with this man I've chosen to rebuild a life with, I'm struck by how much can change when you finally understand that you deserve to be treated with the same consideration you've spent decades giving to others. The woman who was abandoned in that airport medical station might not recognize the woman I am today, but I think she would be proud of how her story ended, not with bitterness or revenge, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes from finally, after all these years, choosing herself.